Chapter 2 of The Powder of Death by Julian Stockwin. The village of Hernich Green, Warwickshire, England. Hocktide Eve, AD 1287, the 15th year of the reign of King Edward I. The rain had eased off, but still threatened as Perkin Slewfoot trudged along the well-worn path towards the tithe barn by the manor house. It was cold and bitter this early in the morning, and being a lowly villain, he wore just a coarse grey wool jerkin, loose leggings, and the old felt hat he'd inherited from his father. His toes showed through his shoes, which were soon caked in mud. He scratched absent-mindedly. The fleas had been merciless during the night. Perkin quickened his pace. He knew the reeve was waiting for him, the hard-faced Hubert Subsea, whose job it was to exact every working hour from those who owed service to their lord of the manor, Sir Robert the Ward. Sometimes it was 2 or 3 days a week he must labour thus under the ancient and inviolable covenant between noble and bound. In return for service in his fields, the lord would graciously extend his protection over him. One morning, 2 winters ago, still in his bed, Perkin's father had turned his face to the wall in silent despair and died. His eldest son had gone to be a mercenary and hadn't been heard of again, and his daughter had been hastily married off at 14. It had left only Perkin to look after his careworn mother in her humble wattle and daub home. He'd always known he'd never marry, for he'd been born with a gnarled ankle that had earned him the name Slewfoot. No girl would look upon such a poor risk as a provider, but he didn't pine, for was this not God's way of caring for his mother? Perkin just got along with his life. With no allowances in their pitiless world for half work, he'd learned the hard way how to keep up with the others, a hand to the plough, the hoe and harrow, and at harvest time the sickle. But provided he laboured on the Lord's stipulated days, including the extra boon work, he was free to work for himself. He had several strips planted in barley and peas. There were 3 geese fattening nicely and a goat for milk, but he'd had to sell the pig after the wet and bleak winter just endured. The reeve shouted at the line of serfs bringing the straw baskets of seed. Perkin filled his pouch, then went off with his friend Godswain, the man's gap-toothed smile always cheering. They set to with their dibbers, each to a strip and within hailing distance. A jab down and a twist in the freshly turned soil, a single bean dropped in and onto the next in a time-worn rhythm. The strips were a train wide and a furlong in length. It was hours before they completed their task, their backs burning with fatigue. The two sat companionably together on the turfed edge of the field and took out their bread and cheese, trimmed with onions. Godswain shared a costal of ale with Perkin. "God's teeth! On your feet, you full-born oafs!" the reeve's snarl cut through the rest. "And we've done it all. The Lord's sowing, Master Subsea," Godswain said nervously. If the reeve had a mind to, they could be brought before the bailiff and fined for default on their obligation to service. "That's as well, you low-arsed pair of drabble rails. I wants to see you behind a plough this afternoon. Sir Robert needs his winter wheat in the ground afore May Day." They hurriedly finished their repast as 2 scraggy beasts were brought up, the plough with a sadly blunted iron share and coulter. As they faced up to the strip, the first drops of rain spattered down, and with it a gusty, spiteful blow. The oxen were balky, wanting their bower, the soil sticky and resisting, but in the driving rain they pushed forward. Perkin at the plough, Godswain with the ox goad, both silent in the shared misery of hard labour in the shuddering wet and cold. It was some consolation that for this crop furrows were shallower, but it was heavy going. Endless hours of flogging both man and beast until their portion was complete. Perkin bid Godswain farewell and tramped home to blessed Surcease. His mother set aside the bundle of rushes she was working on. They would later be dipped into the rancid sheep fat simmering at the hearth in the centre of the room to supply their only light after dark. "Set you down, my son," she fussed as she tended to the other pot on the fire. Waves of weariness came over Perkin, but the suffocating damp, smoky smell, with its overtones of ancient living and animals, was token of home. with all its memories and solace. His mother had been out rush cutting, and the beaten earth floor was covered with fresh grasses, sprinkled with sprays of herbs and wild buds, and from the upper beams hung their 3 new cheeses. "Take off your togs then, my sweeting." She found his old smock. Obediently he stripped off his soaked clothing, which she threw over the wattle partition to the animal's end of the house. She went to the window, a slat with a hide hinge at the top, and took down the stick that held it open. This trapped the smoke from the fire, but helped keep away the flies, as well as retaining a cosy warmth. He felt a twinge of guilt. His mother was worn out, bent and shriveled with age. She showed all of her 30-some winters, and found moving about difficult. "Have you done with the Lord's portion?" "Aye, I have, Ma." But now he had to find the strength to drive the plough again, for a freeman in return for the use of the same for himself later. It was hard to take, so much of his strength going into others' land, but this was the life the good Lord had decreed for him, just as he'd given others the grace to rise above it all. It was no use fretting about what could not be. And didn't Father Bertrand make much of accepting one's lot on earth? She brought him his supper bowl. It was watery peas pottage with a few limp vegetables floating on top. He supped it quickly, the gnawing hunger pangs barely touched. "I wish and all that I had some meat to give you," she said, wistfully. "Perhaps when I sell my cheeses. They're very tasty, even should I say myself." "Yes, Ma," he said mechanically. "There'd been no takers for the last. Why would it be different now?" The night was drawing in, so there was nothing for it but to turn into his leaves and straw bed by the goat. His foot hurt, and it would be another day of work on the morrow. As he finished the last of his black bread, there were voices outside. "Perkin, you sleeping?" It was Godswain. "Wilkie Bates says if you'd fancy a supper ale."